Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. Welcome if you are new. Thank you for taking time out of your day to check the video out. We are talking about Days Gone. So the remastered version of Days Gone just recently launched, and that's what I've been playing. I've been really enjoying it, and as I've been playing through it, it's very much reminding me of how much I enjoyed my first playthrough of this game, Days Gone, back in 2019 on the PS4 Pro. And it's also reminding me of just how much I want a proper sequel to this game. So I want to have a discussion not only about Days Gone Remastered, but I would say more so about the prospect of a sequel actually happening. Will Sony Bend end up finally pursuing a proper Days Gone 2? Well, there are multiple factors here at play as to why we are currently playing the remastered version of Days Gone and not a sequel. And we have to consider these things when we talk about the idea of getting a Days Gone 2. So I want to start here with something that is very recent but very unfortunate regarding Bend Studio, but also may point in the direction of a Days Gone 2. That is their project that they're working on now, or I guess I should say the project that they were working on up till very recently, but was unfortunately canceled. For those who are not aware, Sony Bend announced in 2021 that they were making a new IP. And over the years, we ended up learning that this new IP was actually a live service game, which disappointed many Days Gone fans, to say the least. A lot of people were confused as to why Sony Bend would prefer to work on some kind of live service shooter game rather than making a proper, single player sequel to Days Gone. But it doesn't really matter now because it was reported back in January of this year that Sony Bend's live service game was canceled, alongside Bluepoint Games' apparent God of War live service game, which is not something I care to discuss right now. That's a whole nother conversation, right? But yeah, Bend's game was canceled. So what Bend Studio is doing now is likely having daily meetings trying to figure out what they want to pitch Sony next. Maybe they already did pitch Sony something. It's been a few months, but that's how these things work. If something gets canceled, they have to come together, come up with a new idea, pitch it Sony's way, and find out if it's going to get greenlit or rejected. Now, you obviously have to ask yourself if Days Gone 2 is a pitch that they're considering. And surely, if you are Bend Studio at this point in time, you have to be considering it, right? You have to consider the fact that Days Gone did sell pretty well. And, the reason why I think it wasn't seen as much of a success as, say, something like Horizon Zero Dawn or God of War, because it did sell on that level, was because of its critical reception and also the fact that it had a very tumultuous development cycle, which is something that I think a lot of people don't realize about this game, but it did sell very well and it did garner a very large fan base. You pair that with the fact that they just released a remaster of this game, and if you look at literally any of the marketing surrounding Days Gone Remastered, all you see people saying is, "We want a sequel. Where's Days Gone 2?" You do see people expressing how they're excited to replay this game, of course, and, play a better version of it on PS5 and PS5 Pro. But the number one thing that fans are saying is, we want a sequel. There's no way that Bend Studio and Sony don't see this clear as day. And you consider the position they're in, where they just spent years developing a live service game that culminated in nothing, and, a lot of wasted time, a lot of wasted resource. You're probably, if you're Bend Studio, thinking maybe we should try to play it a bit safe. Whatever we choose to pitch Sony next should be maybe a bit on the safer side, certainly not another live service game. I mean, what's the first thing that pops into your mind at this point? I think Days Gone 2 is the first thing that pops into your mind. But there's something else I want to mention here that maybe gives us another hint, or at the very least should indicate that Sony would like Bend Studio to do more with Days Gone, and that is the fact that back in August of 2022, it was reported by Deadline that a Days Gone movie is in development. And what makes it even more interesting is they have some pretty serious talent behind this movie. So PlayStation Productions announced that they're doing a Days Gone movie, which has Oscar-nominated scribe Sheldon Turner writing it. And they say here that Deadline reports, Quote, I hear Turner's script will be a love ballad to motorcycle movies, the bike being Deacon's sole form of transportation, his horse in this would-be modern-day Western. So Vendetta Productions is also producing with PlayStation Productions. Now, this was back in August of 2022, and we haven't had really any significant updates on this, but it does seem like it was not canceled. It's still something that's in the works, considering the talent they have attached to it. And you also have to maybe ask yourself why they announced this back in 2022, and it hasn't really made much progress. You have to wonder if maybe Sony is seriously trying to make a play here for something more significant with Days Gone, and now that Ben Studio is in this position where they got to start work on another game after their live service title was canceled. I think you guys see where I'm going with this. It's starting to look like the stars are aligning, and there's just simply no reason why Days Gone 2 shouldn't happen at this point, and this shouldn't become a bigger franchise for PlayStation. But with that being said, I want to highlight a couple of the things here that, kind of explain why this hasn't already happened. And the biggest is a bit of a misconception when it comes to why Days Gone 2 never got greenlit, right? For a long time, and I think some people still believe this, and it makes sense why they would, they thought it was Sony rejecting Days Gone 2. Ben Studio pitched Days Gone 2, and Sony said, no, we don't want to do that because the game didn't review well enough. There's no denying that Days Gone did not get the best critical reception. We covered that back at the launch, and I still stand by pretty much all of what I said, or most of what I said, where I think that there were some reviewers, some review outlets, if you know, that were for some reason focused on the wrong things when they were reviewing Days Gone and not really focused on the game itself. And I think it got treated a bit unfairly because of that. That's not to say that it was perfect. It was not perfect. It did have issues. It did launch buggy because most reviewers were not playing it with a day one patch. So, there were fair criticisms. I'm not sitting here telling you Days Gone was a 9 or a 10 out of 10 game, right? It had some issues, but it certainly was not a 5 out of 10 game either. Anyway, I digress. I want to let you guys know that the reason why Days Gone 2 never happened was because it was never actually pitched to Sony to begin with. Unfortunately, there was some internal strife and some major disagreements with Sony Bend. They were having some issues behind the scenes. And it says here, Ben Studio released Days Gone in 2019, following which there was supposedly some turmoil between studio leadership over the game's sequel. This ultimately led to the departure of Jeff Ross and John Garvin, both of Days Gone's directors, and Ben Studio set to work on a brand new IP, which we already covered, that ended up unfortunately getting canceled. And so, when you look even further into this, I mean, there's a lot that can be extracted from this, because the thing is, both John Garvin and Jeff Ross have done multiple interviews over the years, but it's just that two of the biggest pieces of the Days Gone puzzle, I guess you could say, are no longer at the studio. And you have to ask yourself how that impacts the entire studio's decision-making on, maybe why they want to just move on and not do a Days Gone 2. It's a pretty complicated situation, as I said earlier. And so at the end of the day, I can't really tell you whether or not we're going to get a Days Gone 2. I can't even say that I'm confident we're going to get a Days Gone 2. All I can really say with certainty is that we did get a Days Gone remaster, right? That a lot of people are playing right now. We are looking at a Days Gone movie down the pipeline. And with those two things in mind, we consider the fact that Sony Bend is in a position where they have to figure out what they're going to pitch Sony next. I think this is the perfect time for Sony Bend to say, you know what, let's do a Days Gone 2, right? Fans have waited long enough. This is the perfect opportunity. What Days Gone 2 will end up being without two of the, directors that were involved with it no longer being involved, it's hard to say. Maybe it's one of these things where it's like, be careful what you wish for. And there's also every chance that Sony Bend could just decide we're going to make a new single-player IP, or maybe return to Siphon Filter or something along those lines. And I don't think people would be too upset about that. But I just, I do have to sit here and wonder if maybe now is the right time for them to pursue this. And frankly, I hope they do, right? Because as I said, I've been spending a lot of time playing Days Gone Remastered, and it's just reminding me as I get further in the game and I start to really get immersed in it that this was one of the better games, at least in my opinion, and I think in the opinion of many others, that launched during the PS4 generation. We see games like Ghost of Tsushima blowing up, getting major sequels. We talk about The Last of Us Part 2. We talk about Horizon Zero Dawn. We talk about God of War 2018. And again, I'm not trying to say that Days Gone is as good or better than any of those games. It's not about making comparisons. It's just about, I guess, giving the credit to Sony Bend and that, like, yeah, dude, I think they held their own with Days Gone. And they were up there, I think, making a great game alongside these other great studios and great properties. And it just is a bit disappointing to see that all these other games, you know, are getting sequels, getting all the treatment. And for some reason, Days Gone, it's just like, well, yeah, I don't know. It's just not getting the same treatment for one reason or another. But I just wanted to take a little bit of time here to talk about this. And I'm going to be really interested to see what you guys have to say. I know that there are a lot of people on this channel who watch the videos that do like Days Gone and are fans of Days Gone. So let me know what you think about this conversation. Leave the video a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you're new. Hit the bell notification icon and feel free to share the video on top of all that. But until next time, guys, take care.